And now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague in the Center for Jewish Studies, Professor Michelle Hamilton, a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the U, and also the director of the Center for Medieval Studies. Michelle has been one of the most active and generous faculty members in the Center for Jewish Studies and is known on campus, in the Twin Cities community, nationally and internationally as a scholar who has made significant contributions to our understanding of Arabic, Hebrew, and Romance literatures of medieval Iberia. Her first book, Representing Others in Medieval Iberian Literature, published in 2007, was followed by her recent monograph, Beyond Faith, Belief, Morality, and Memory in a 15th Century Judeo-Iberian Manuscript. Her talk tonight is entitled Sephardic Food and Identity in Medieval Spain. So please join me in welcoming Michelle Hamilton, and I'd also like to mention that afterwards you're invited to continue the conversation over a reception in the social hall. So thank you all for coming.
Okay, thank you, Leslie, for that introduction. Can you guys hear me? And thanks to Temple of Aaron for inviting me, and for Jewish Studies for inviting me to give this talk. And you probably saw I changed my title a little bit. I included early modern because several of the examples I'm going to talk about tonight are from the 16th century. I think they still reflect in many ways what was happening in medieval Spain. But I did want to put that. And I also put my informal title, as I realized I kept calling this talk Food Fight. So, and I think it will become obvious why that's my informal title for this paper. So a lot of people today, I think, are interested in the study of food and, of course, always interested in food itself, both in the academy and in popular culture. I have been a member of a pre-modern food studies group at the University of Minnesota, which has been very exciting this semester. So we've been looking not only at how food was prepared, but also the material aspects of, trade routes, where it came from, what was available. And that's been, an exciting impetus, I think, in part to how I've been thinking about food for this. And also I'm planning, as the director of medieval studies, to have a conference and bring a lot of scholars on food studies next year. So I've been thinking about food for a while. And I'm sure all of you have also noticed the foodie culture in the Twin Cities and beyond the Twin Cities, all of the cookbooks and TV shows, radio shows. It's really hard to get away from, featuring sometimes authentic recipes and food preparation and traditions passed down from grandmothers and past generations. So I picked a book where, they have all the grandmothers they could get together, right? It's not just one grandmother, it's several. But this idea of past generation, what people did in the past with food, and what people do in other cultures with food is interesting. And it's a way of accessing a foreign culture or of maintaining ties to a homeland or a family's traditions. The academic study of food's important role in culture, of the way food preparation, attitudes toward food, and the traditions of how we eat. So table manners, taboos, who we eat with, who we don't eat with. And the study of that is what we call foodways, and has become increasingly popular. There are recently created programs in food studies at NYU, the New School, the University of Indiana, and also the University of Toronto, which has a very impressive food studies program. And I'm sure many of you, as I mentioned, watch and listen to the many, many shows about food. I have examples, but okay. There has also been any number of critical programs and books that focus on the ill effects of processed and fast food and the benefits of home-cooked meals, locally sourced foods, certain diets, vegetarian, pescatarian, the paleo diet. And the latter often blur the line between the tangible realms of taste or the body and the subjective realm of emotional or subjective claims at happiness and well-being and the like. And this equation of food and foodways with both physical and spiritual or emotional results is not a new phenomenon. Perhaps The most famous of Sephardi intellectuals, Maimonides, early in the first book of the Mishneh Torah, begins his chapter on general proper behavior with a description of food and taste. Maimonides, bringing in his knowledge as a medical doctor, describes how the taste buds of the sick, whether physically or emotionally sick, can be confused because of illness, right? Sweet becomes bitter and bitter becomes sweet. So, and you can see, I hope everyone can see these quotes. I didn't realize the screen would be back here. But, you know, he talks about the physically ill, and then he says, similarly, those who are morally ill, right, their tastes are skewed. Elsewhere in the Mishneh Torah, Maimonides claims that maintaining a healthy and sound body is among the ways of God, asserting that people should make sure and only eat when hungry, not eat until full, and be seated to eat, amongst many other things. And I couldn't resist putting in this. We have this hanging on our refrigerator. This is from Michael Pollan's new book, Food Rules, right? And I just, when I was reading through Maimonides, it had so many echoes, right? He says, you know, eat at meals. Don't eat until you're overly full. It just, the echoes of Maimonides, for me, merited putting this up. So Maimonides lists several harmful foods in the Mishneh Torah, including lentils, chickpeas, matzah, cabbage, onions, garlic, mustard, and radishes, as well as aged wine and cheese, which he deems almost poisonous. So much for the Mediterranean diet, right? In addition, he says that, and I quote, one should always avoid fruits and not eat them in quantity, even when dried, and it goes without saying when they are fresh. Fortunately, figs, grapes, and almonds are always beneficial, both fresh and dried. Honey and wine are bad for the young, but fortunately are wholesome for the old. So, and I wanted to put up this image. This is from the first printed edition of the Mishneh Torah in Amsterdam, which had a huge Sephardic community. And you can see it has the frontispiece, it has the title, and then next to it, it has all these images of vines, of grapevines, right? And it's about, you know, how they should be planted, not to be too close to have the mixing of the plants. But still, I think when we think of Mishneh Torah today, we don't think, you know, that this would be the central image on the front of the book. Let's see. Maimonides equates taste and consumption with the spiritual and moral health of the individual. In this, he follows the Greco-Roman medieval tradition and the medical advice of Galen, Dioscorides, and Hippocrates, whose works he was familiar with, and who similarly prescribed diets designed to promote both physical and spiritual health. And I think Michael Pollan and his interpreters or continuators and their arguments about food and health resonate. So again, Michael Pollan's book, and then a website based on it where it really equates the soul. You know, you feed your body, feed your soul. Let's see, this conflation of food and foodways with morality and spirituality, the idea that foodways reflected the soul and spiritual well-being, were amplified and came to have sometimes dire consequences in Christian Spain. In late medieval Spain, such ideas were not confined to the field of medicine or to health as we see them today, and it is arguably in the realm of religion and social, or what today we might call state control, that food and foodways became central in both the thought and daily practices of late medieval Iberian and Spanish intellectuals. In late medieval Spain and its colonies, and I'll talk a little bit about Mexico and also about Rome tonight, in the context of newly converted Christians of Jewish descent and a large Muslim population that was the focus of an armed campaign designed to force them out of the peninsula in the late 1400s, food and foodways become an ideological battlefield. So the food fight in my title. They're a way of defining one's identity as a trustworthy Christian and Spaniard, or alternatively as a secret Jew or a Muslim, who many Christians, including the king and queen and the inquisitors that they commissioned, thought were determined to undermine the social order, the authority of the church and the state, or the royal authority. As the Spanish scholar Americo Castro noted, Spanish society in the late 15th century came to be defined by what he calls its tocinophilia, which is a love of bacon, or a love of pork. Castro thought that Cervantes, probably the greatest Spanish author, the best-known Spanish author, who married a new Christian, or a converso, someone of Jewish descent, was himself a converso. For Americo Castro, Cervantes' identity as a converso, and his sympathy for the conversos, or the new Christians, explains his, Cervantes' novel and critical stance toward the oppressive and monolithic attitudes of 16th century Christian Spanish society that we find in Don Quixote. Castro argues that Don Quixote takes as its target the rotten and dangerous form of Christian intolerance present in 16th century Spain, as embodied in the comic, pathetic lead character, Don Quixote himself. Castro creatively described this old Christian ethos founded on a rejection of Spain's Jewish and Muslim past as a celebration of what he calls, and I quote, it's an English translation, the mystical marriage of the soul and bacon. And I actually found a blog that's called Soul Bacon. And I encourage you not to search for this because you will find it's a very Southern Confederate blog. So the rest of my examples are not from popular culture tonight, but they do illustrate how food and foodways did serve as markers of identity in Spanish society amongst neighbors who had, in many cases, intermarried, who had shared a language, they'd shared clothing styles, they'd shared neighborhoods, they lived in the same spaces, they celebrated feasts and holidays together, and they went to the same markets, they went to the same public wells and the same communal ovens, and even the same churches. And food preparation became fraught with symbolic meaning in this milieu. It was the one hint that someone may not be who you believe them to be or who they claim to be. And as we will see, it is not just writers like Cervantes or inquisitors and their victims who seem obsessed with food and its preparation in pre-modern Spain and beyond, again, across the Spanish-speaking world. Tonight, we'll see how a wide swath of people, from court poets and chroniclers to servants and maids and prostitutes, focus on food and foodways as markers of Jewish or converso identity. And foodways, real and imagined, because many of these I think are imagined, could be used aggressively and in a confrontational way against or alternatively in order to create the enemy. And here I want to just make clear that especially the first example, several of them are offensive, and I don't advocate or support these examples in any way, but I think they're important to contextualize the responses in the examples that come afterward. And all of my examples then from now on are from the 15th and 16th centuries when there was increasing pressure on the Jews in the peninsula to convert, which of course culminated in the Edict of Expulsion in 1492, when they were forced to convert or be exiled. This created a society in which those who did convert, the conversos as they're called in Spanish, and their descendants then faced growing suspicion about the sincerity of their conversion, whether they really had wholeheartedly accepted Christianity. And it's in this social situation that food and foodways, as I've mentioned, take on epic proportions and become litmus tests for religious and Spanish identity. So the court chronicler for Isabel and Ferdinand, who signed this Edict of Expulsion, Andrés Bernaldez, in fact, reflects this very attitude in his conflation of Jewish thought with food habits. So I wanted to include the Spanish, but I hope that you can see the English below. And all of the English translations in the works that I show are mine. But here you can see how Bernaldez talks about the fact that Jews wouldn't cook with pork lard, right? That they used aceite, and in Spanish, aceite is olive oil. Right, in this context, they used olive oil instead, and he says because of that, they smelled, and then at the end he says, well, it was because of the way they cooked, and also because they weren't baptized, right? So he's conflating these two things, and of course it's nonsensical. But as Hilary Pomeroy points out, here we see how the religion of the Jews and their descendants has been characterized, defined, and identified with their culinary habits or their foodways. And this will be the focus, of the rest of the examples, how both accounts of and fictionalized representations of Jewish foodways by both so-called old Christians, which is how Spaniards who thought that they had been Christian for generations and had never mixed with either Jews or Muslims. That's how they referred to themselves, as old Christians, to distinguish themselves from new Christians, people who had converted more recently. Let's see. So old Christians use this to characterize, define, and establish identity. So let's turn to another example from the 16th century that also reveals the same attitude. And this is by the established and renowned Spanish poet and nobleman, Francisco de Quevedo. And I pulled this up. This is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. So if you look him up today, you'll find this sort of glowing description of him. He's considered one of the luminaries of the Spanish tradition. If you teach Spanish literature, you definitely teach Quevedo. And here it says, you know, he's unequaled in Spanish literature. And this portrait, which was long thought to be by Velázquez, they recently say, no, it's the workshop of Velázquez. But you can see he's painted in his garb of the Order of Santiago. So he was a member of a religious knighthood and very proud of it. He was a nobleman. Let's see, he reflects the similar attitude, though. And here you have one of his poems in which he defines himself. And he openly mocks conversos. Here he talks about Jews. And here we see him mock sort of kashrut, or the dietary norms of Jews, or the aversion to pork, and extol his own consumption of pork products, right? So he says, I make my pot with pig's feet, right? And he talks about pork bellies, and their frying. His verses, I think, are self-explanatory. I would just note, though, the open hostility toward Jews and his own celebration of what he calls old Christian identity, which seems entirely identified with cooking pork here. And it also seems like something that is in the blood that's aroused by frying pork. So Quevedo wrote several verses dedicated to his great rival, Luis de Góngora, who you have here in a portrait that is by Velázquez, who was another luminary of the Spanish Golden Age. And actually a whole form of Spanish literature is named for him. It's called Gongorismo. But he is thought to be of converso origins. And Quevedo tells him in a sonnet, it's like a sonnet insult to Góngora. He says, Yo te untaré mis obras con tocino, porque no me las muerdas con gorilla. I will anoint my works with bacon fat, so that you will not bite them or eat them, little Góngora. So while this exchange of barbs amongst luminaries, these luminary figures from Spanish literature, reveals how court poetry was a vehicle for insults and identity politics, which have become, by the 16th century, de facto nationalist debates about who belongs in Spain and who has a claim to Spanish identity, we also find poetry composed by lesser poets of Jewish descent, known in Spanish as conversos, as I mentioned, that similarly reveal how the debate played out in the everyday lives and lived experiences of people in late medieval Spain. So the next examples are from the 1400s, so before the expulsion. Rodrigo Cota was part of a well-known Toledan family of conversos, and he wrote a poem about his nephew, Juan Arias, who he describes as un mancebo sin mal, de muy honrado cajal, a young man without flaw from a very honored Jewish community. These works are in the Cancionero General, which is a collection, one of the earliest collections of Spanish cancionero poetry, so Spanish poetry from this epoch. And so his nephew, who he considered a very honored young man, or a man from an honored Jewish community, married an old Christian woman. So he married into an old Christian family. And Rodrigo Cota wrote a very long poem about the wedding, and I'm going to show just one of the stanzas. And you see the tension between the two groups, right? The new Christians and the old Christians at this wedding. And it takes form, at least in this stanza, in the shape of what was being served to the wedding guest. So you see here that he says, in this Jewish community's wedding, no tough skin. David Gitlitz translate this as pigskin was eaten, nor fish without scale, as insofar as the bridegroom was able, right? But instead, a lot of eggplant and saffron with Swiss chard, and whosoever might say Jesus at the dinner may not eat meatballs, right? So while the conversos may have formally and publicly accepted Christianity, it was much more difficult to change their eating habits from one day or one generation to the next. Cota's poetic description of the wedding banquet also reminds us that in 15th century Spain, conversos, these new Christians, still belonged to families and communities in which there were many practicing Jews during the 15th century. Here it seems Cota's nephew, the bridegroom, took into account the dietary preferences of his guests by serving kosher food, no shellfish or tough meat, and who served a typically Sephardic meal with lots of saffron and eggplant. The aversion to saying the Christian grace and mentioning Jesus points to the foodways of the Jewish and converso communities. And anyone who would violate those norms and say Jesus or say the grace would not, in Cota's opinion, get to have the best of the foods that is being served, which is the albondigas, the meatballs. The conflict, and then another example is the conflicted new Christian poet Antón de Montoro, who gave voice to how difficult it was to be a new Christian in 15th century Spain. Montoro was of humble origins, and we know him as a poet, and he left a diwan, or collection of poems, of 154 poems. So he was quite prolific. But his day job was as a tailor and a clothes salesman. And we're just going to look at one of his poems, but he is, an accomplished poet. Here's a will, so we have his signature, and the cover of the modern edition of his poems. And he uses the forms popular in Spanish courtly poetry. But in these poems, while he's using these forms that the other poets are using, he talks about his big Jewish family and the issues they face in an increasingly hostile society. So he complains bitterly, for example, when the chief magistrate prohibits all butchers in Córdoba from selling anything but pork. So he writes a poem complaining about that. And just after the violent pogroms in Córdoba and Carmona, which are two cities in the south of Spain, in 1473 and 1474, Montoro addressed this autobiographic poem to Queen Isabel, who came on a visit to the city. And here I hope you can see in this. He says, "Hice el crede," so I said the credo, promising to adore pots of fat bacon and half-cooked pork rinds, right? So this echo of what we'll find later in Quevedo. And he says it didn't do any good, right? He still couldn't shake, the rastro de confeso, right? This mark of being a converso. And that, he is still called, or I can't be rid of the name of Old Nam Jew. Montoro's experiences and his poetry lend credence, I think, to Americo Castro's description of late medieval and Renaissance Spain as defined by tocinophilia, right? This love of pork. The attitude that he claims Cervantes sought to call out, and that undergirded the growing, and in Cervantes' opinion, false distinction between new and old Christians. There's also a parallel phenomenon that I just wanted to bring up that recently critics like Hilary Pomeroy and Barry Taylor have examined that we could describe as a counter-reaction amongst Jewish and converso intellectuals. And Barry Taylor calls this tocinophobia, so the hatred of bacon or the violent reaction against pork and pork products. And if we turn from these literary examples that we've just looked at, which are crafted by poets, who have given the attitudes toward Jewish and converso foodways symbolic representation in their poetry, I think we see how both of these attitudes, tocinophilia and tocinophobia, play out in another type of document, and this is inquisitorial records. And how in both, in the poetry and in these Inquisition documents, they are symptomatic aspects of a complex cultural phenomenon. So I want to show some examples from how the attitudes played out, their consequences for real people living in Spain and in New Spain, which is today it's Mexico. And these are from documents recorded in the 15th and 16th centuries. Again, as many have noted, they are documents recorded by Christians. They're recorded by the Dominicans, seeking to make a case against the witnesses and those who are accused, whose voices have been recorded, but they're always filtered, right, through this Christian filter. So these are all Christian accounts. As several scholars, such as David Gitlitz and Eliezer Goodworth note, though, they are nevertheless very valuable in preserving details of how crypto-Jews, which is how in scholarship we call the secret Jews, right, the converted Jews practicing Judaism in secret, and how they maintain or tried to maintain their Judaism through a series of actions in their daily life. So in the first years of the Inquisition in Spain, in the 1480s, in the western Spanish town of Guadalupe, I don't know if you can see on this, it's just southwest of Madrid. So I'm talking about a town that's right here. This is Madrid. So here's Guadalupe. I'm going to mention Trujillo, Ciudad Real, and Teruel, which is right here, just to sort of orient you in Spain. Let's see. Okay. All right, so in that town of Guadalupe, the butcher's wife, Mari Sanchez, found herself accused of practicing Judaism in secret, and food and foodways are front and center in the accusations brought against her. The small town hosted lots of Christian pilgrims because it was the home of the monastery of the Virgen Morena, the Dark Virgin. Mari Sanchez and her husband were among the town's thriving middle class of artisans, and they lived well until the 1480s. As Gretchen Starr-Lebeau notes, Mari Sanchez's life was completely typical of the women of Guadalupe, except for the fact that everyone believed she practiced Judaism. And until the inquisitors arrived in town, no one seems to have cared. But Guadalupe was one of the first towns where the Inquisition went to work, and the inquisitors arrived in 1485. So this is really in the first year that it was established. And as soon as they got there, they cited 200 new Christians. So in fact, the mayor, the chief of arms, the sheriff, and several of the monastery's lay scribes, so the people who worked in the monastery but weren't part of the order, as well as tailors, cobblers, and artisans were new Christians. So it seems like many people in this town were of Jewish descent. Mari Sanchez's servants and old Christian neighbors described how she ate with Jews, prepared adafina, which is the Sabbath stew, and sometimes prayed Jewish prayers, as well as fasted. She admits that she mourned her deceased husband according to Jewish customs, including eating on the floor for 9 days. She had observed the Sabbath by putting on clean clothes and lighting candles, and she maintained a kosher diet, and observed Jewish fasts such as Yom Kippur. And she ate on common Christian fast days. So if it was a day she was supposed to be fasting, according to the Christian calendar, she made a point of eating, which is typical, I think, in a lot of the Inquisition trials that I've looked at. And she used illness as an excuse to eat meat on Fridays, right, which she wasn't supposed to do. Particularly damning, it seems, for Mari Sanchez is the fact that she ate with Jews. On a visit to Trujillo, she not only visited the synagogue, but she also had quesadillas with a Jewish merchant with whom she did business while at home in Guadalupe. So moving from this town, from Guadalupe to Toledo, which is just south of Madrid. If you've been to Spain, you've probably visited Toledo. And moving from the end of the 15th century to the end of the 16th century, we find a series of inquisitorial cases that similarly focus on both with whom and what exactly people ate as proof of their Judaizing. These cases have been very productively studied by David Gitlitz, who, with his wife, Linda Davidson, they have used some of them to develop recipes for a cookbook, which I definitely recommend. It's called A Drizzle of Honey. So they've done the work, right? They've gone through the Inquisition accounts, they've taken out the descriptions, and then they've tried them at home a bunch, and now they've put it into a form that you can replicate at home. And I have one copy of a recipe from their book if anyone wants it afterward. It's a good eggplant recipe. But David Gitlitz is a scholar who has also published widely on these Inquisition records. And he has found in 1580 Toledo Ana de Lagos, who reported to the Inquisition that her neighbors made a stew of meat, parsley, onions, cabbage, and mint. And Gitlitz notes that such stews, which are called adafina, the Sabbath stew, could be a vegetarian dish made with eggplants and onions, as Isabel González did in 16th century Ciudad Real, or as her relative in the same city, Mayor González, who used eggs, spices, and carrots. But a friend of theirs made their adafina with cold eggplant, cilantro, and spices. So you have these people being interrogated by the Inquisition about what exactly they put into their adafina, right? And they know, so it reveals not only this network, but differences in the ways that people made the same dish. Adafina could also be made from a variety of meats: mutton in Teruel, goat in the Canary Islands, which isn't on this. Here's a map. It's not on the map, but it would be down by the coast of Africa. And you could also put in meatballs, right? That specialty from the wedding, albóndigas. Blanca Ramirez in Toledo in 1523 would put in her adafina little cooked and half-cooked balls of meat. Gitlitz notes that her Inquisition trial record gives us one of the most complete set of instructions for adafina, or the Sabbath stew. Her maid Maria, so they're asking the maids who are around all the time what exactly people were cooking. And Maria tells the inquisitors that Blanca, used garbanzos, broad beans, fatty meat, and if eggplants were in season, they used eggplants. They put in lots of cilantro. Hilary Pomeroy points out that the eggplant, mentioned here, like meatballs, was a staple of Sephardi food that the Jews of Spain adopted from the foodways of the earlier Arabic Andalusi tradition. A Spanish colleague, Juan Gil, has studied the extensive references to eggplant or rather insulting people by calling them eggplant eaters. You find a lot of that in Spanish court poetry. And I'm not going to give those examples, but if you want them, Juan Gil has a great study about eggplant eaters. But I do want to pull out a couple of other important threads, which I think are very illuminating, in following the Spanish obsession or fascination with Sephardi foodways out of the Iberian Peninsula and into the larger Spanish-speaking world. So now I want to turn to one of the most fascinating cases of Jewish and converso identity formation in colonial Spain, or Mexico. This is recorded in the Inquisition trials of the Carvajal family at the end of the 16th century. So in addition to the trial records from the Inquisition, a diary or a memoir was penned by Luis de Carvajal, who was the central propagator, although I actually wouldn't call him the central propagator. He's known as that, but his sisters, Isabel and Leonor, also had central roles in sort of maintaining the family, Jewish traditions in the family. But Luis has received the lion's share of attention. And he sought to maintain Jewish rights and thought within this large family of conversos, trying to live as Jews in New Spain. This work, his memoir, has recently come to light after having been stolen in Mexico in the 1930s. So here you have a recent picture of it. And it's now being called the first written Jewish text from the Americas. So I put up a headline from a Mexican newspaper calling it, this is the first Jewish text from the Americas. And on the left, it was actually on exhibit in New York. They did an exhibit after they found it. Apparently, someone found it at a pawn shop and knew what it was. So, a collector bought it, and now it's on display, and it's gone back to Mexico since being on exhibit in New York. But food was of central importance for the Carvajales, for this family in 16th century Mexico, and was key in how they constructed a Jewish identity in the Catholic Spanish Empire. In the surviving testimony of several members of the family, there are fairly detailed accounts of how the family members supported each other in their faith for a period of several years, and how they gathered on Fridays when possible to recite verses and prepare food as best they could according to what they knew of or what they believed about Jewish norms and rituals. And after having been pardoned for Judaizing in an Inquisition trial in Mexico City in 1589, it seems the family continued to practice their personal form of Judaism to the best of their ability in Mexico and under the suspicious eyes of the Inquisition for several years. And it was their uncle, Luis de Carvajal, the senior, who brought them. He was an early Spanish colonizer, and he's considered to be the first Spaniard to set foot in Texas. And he was an early settler of much of northern Mexico, so Monterrey, San Luis Potosí, Tampico. He was very powerful and influential, and he brought his sister and all his sister's children, and this is this family, Luis and the sisters, to New Spain. He also got the oldest brother, Gaspar, into the Dominican order. But it seems, apart from Gaspar, the other 7 children and their mother considered themselves and lived secretly as Jews. And they were all eventually tried by the Inquisition in Mexico, and several of them were killed in a very public auto de fe in 1596. So Leonor, whose testimony I have worked with, and you have a photocopy of it here, and this is currently housed at UC Berkeley. She recites the Law of Moses to the inquisitors. And it's a poem. It's a very fascinating document. So it's a very long poem, and it's in the style of the cancioneros in that earlier poetry we saw. And she said that the family would sing this poem on Friday night when they were getting ready for the Sabbath. And she recites 12 stanzas of it, and the inquisitor's like, this poem is really long. Can you just summarize it for me? Right? And, it's like, era muy prolijo. It's just too long. So then he puts in the summary that she gives him, and she tells him that the rest of the stanzas talk about the celebration of La Pascua del Cordero, which is Passover, when they ate unleavened bread, the feast day of the Dia Grande del Señor, which is Yom Kippur, right? She also calls it penitencia, and the keeping of what she calls the Pascua de las Cabañuelas, or Sukkot. She then gives a brief synopsis of the rules of kashrut, which apparently were part of the song that they sang, right? So we only have her summary of it, but we have to imagine, what the poem must have sounded like. Leonor's brother, Luis, who, as I mentioned, has received the lion's share of attention, included foodways as front and center in his description to the inquisitors of how exactly he had practiced Judaism since the age of 14, he says. So 3 years before coming to Mexico, he had been, practicing Judaism. And he says, since being 14 in Medina del Campo, which is in central Spain, where his older brother Balthasar taught him the tenets of the Jewish faith, he'd fasted on Kippur, El Dia del Perdón, as well as kept the Sabbath, reciting Psalms and fasting on Mondays and Thursdays, which is significant because the Catholic Church had fast days for Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. So he's fasting on the opposite days, as we saw in the earlier example. And he says he does all this in guarda de dicha ley de Moisés, so to keep the law of Moses, which he defiantly and repeatedly told the inquisitors was superior to what he calls the false religion of Catholicism. And using Deuteronomy, Psalms, and the books of the prophets from Latin versions of the Bible. He only had access to the Latin versions, the Christian versions. But he cites biblical passages to the inquisitors in Latin. And he argues that the prophecies foretelling the Messiah do not refer to Christ, who is a false prophet. So he gets in a lot of trouble. So Miriam Bodian has a really excellent study of this family, and she really focuses on the texts that are being used. And so Luis's testimony and that of his sisters, taken over a series of weeks and months, gives us a fairly detailed account of their life and what they did to observe what they call the ley de Moisés, including fasting and eating or avoiding certain foods. So this is from Luis's testimony, where he talks about observing holidays. He talks about doing a 3-day fast for Esther. Miriam Bodian says that this, he uses this from what he was reading, that Jews in the peninsula did a 1-day fast for Esther. He also talks about pork, not eating the blood or fat, which are supposed to be used for sacrifices, and eating pork incites one to the sin of passion. And then he said he did this for 3 to 4 years in Panuco, which is another region, sort of on the Gulf Coast. And so here Luis gives the inquisitors a brief synopsis of the Jewish holidays, Hanukkah and Purim, as well as the rules of kashrut. Miriam Bodian points out, as I said, the 3-day fast. That's something they seem to have made up or modified according to what they were reading. But controlling what he ate and drank, as well as self-enforced fasting, were for Luis symbolic acts of defiance, and one of the few things that he had any control over while he was incarcerated in the Inquisition prisons. And he tells of fasting every day except Saturday when he's in prison, and of avoiding pork in the food that he was served by the jailers. He also decides not to drink water during the day while being held in the prison because, according to him, in Jewish tradition, on Yom Kippur, the day of penance, one doesn't drink when fasting. So basically he starts fasting as if it was Yom Kippur every day while he's in the Inquisition prisons. He then tells the inquisitors of how he had observed Yom Kippur before being taken prisoner. And he tells, so here you have the last Yom Kippur that he celebrated before being taken by the Inquisition. And he was in a little Indian village near the town of Pachuca, right? And he goes and he bathes in a creek. And then he's not sure which day is actually Yom Kippur. So he just fasts for 3 days. And we also find out that he writes to his friend Manuel de Lucena and says, hey, I think it's Yom Kippur, can you help me out? Lucena sends him some candles and some fritters, right, so to help him in his celebration. So we find out that he's a member of a larger secret community who used the resources that they had, the isolation of an indigenous community, Pachuca, fritters and candles from Lucena, and in other sections he also talks about eating tortillas for unleavened bread, which were available during Passover. We also know he used the Latin Vulgate versions of the Old Testament to maintain and nurture his Jewish identity in the farthest corner of the Spanish Empire. So as a complement to Luis's Inquisition trial record, and as my last example, I want to turn to an early 16th century fictional work whose protagonist is a beautiful Sephardi woman and ex-prostitute who moves to Rome. And Rome at the time had a very large Sephardic community. This is the 1500s, including several Sephardic synagogues. And this work is La Lozana Andaluz. It was penned by a new Christian author, Francisco Delicado, who, like the poet Anton de Montoro, whose work we saw, was born in the city of Cordoba. In this work, food, again, is front and center. So here's an image from a wood block from the print. If you can see Lozana, the woman in the center, but she's in her kitchen doing someone's hair. There's pots and ingredients hanging in the background. In the opening scene, after the author's introduction, Lozana offers a self-portrait in which she defines herself by her food knowledge, a knowledge learned from her grandmother. So, and again, this is my translation, but she tells us that she learned how to make noodles, mini empanadas, couscous with garbanzos, as well as little round meatballs, and that she's famous for her meatballs. So while albóndigas, meatballs, may be her specialty, prepared in the Andalusi and Converso way, she goes on to list, after this section, a large number of dishes she learned to make from her grandmother. And her grandmother apparently had access to the best ingredients in Spain. She got honey from Adamuz, saffron from Peñafiel, and ingredients from other regions of Spain. And she tells her aunt that her grandmother taught her how to make stewed eggplant, twice-baked eggplant casserole, Ceuta-style roasted kid with lemon, Morisco-style casseroles, puff pastries, honey-sprinkled fried dough, almond cookies, sesame meringues, nut and honey-filled pastries, fried dough, phyllo treats, nut butter pastries with oil, and these are called in Spanish, hormigos torcidos con aceite. And these are important because they appear later in the work and they prove very important in determining Lozana's fate. Because once Lozana arrives in Rome, where she doesn't know anyone and she's lost all of her money, she immediately goes to the neighborhood of Pozo Blanco, which has a huge converso population. So people speak Spanish. And she comes upon a group of converso women. So they're sitting outside, like sitting on the stoop, and they're not really sure what to make of her. They're unsure of her identity. And they ask, so to figure out who she is, they ask her how she would cook a particular meal. So here's the scene. I didn't put the entire Spanish in here, but Beatriz, these are the women sitting around in Rome. And Beatriz says, I just like to find out whether or not she is a new Jewish convert. You know, una conversa is what she says in the Spanish. So we could talk freely. So they go back and forth. It's like, oh, I don't know. But her friend Teresa has an idea. She's like, okay, why not try this? Let's say we want to make some nut butter pastries and some couscous. If she knows the recipe, right, then we'll know, you know, whether she's one of us, according to how she cooks it. And of course, Lozana passes with flying colors because she uses oil, right, to cook the nut butter pastries, and she uses cilantro, which is a Sephardic ingredient, or it was identified at least with the Sephardim, right? She says, hey, what are you guys talking about, when she walks up to the women? And they're like, oh, we were just, you know, talking about we're going to make these dishes. And she's like, oh, you've got to have oil, you've got to have cilantro. And the women are like, oh, she's one of us, right? So as you can see from these examples, from La Lozana, food is central in the work. Evelyn Nadeau, and I'm going to plug her study, it's a great study, argues that the fact that the author of this work, Francisco Delicado, about whom we know very little, although critics do almost unanimously agree that he is a new Christian or converso, he describes in such detail these Sephardi dishes, and the fact that he gives them such a crucial role in the fate of the conversa protagonist reflects what Nadeau calls a nostalgia for cultural converso heritage. And that this nostalgia stands in direct contrast to and even undermines the political position of Spain's cultural heritage. So although with very different consequences, and in the context of a fictional work, Lozana's cultural memory is a Sephardi conversa, like those of the Carvajals in Mexico or New Spain, establish and keep alive the medieval cultural traditions, the foodways and the ideas associated with them that we've been looking at tonight. Even as the Spanish monarchy and the church hierarchy sought to erase them completely, not only through political campaigns, but also through the Inquisition. And in these examples, I think we find descriptions of the food and foodways of the Spanish past, including the contributions of Muslims and Jews. That is, even though the Catholic monarchs and their heirs sought to create a Catholic empire defined by the culture and norms of the old Christian Castilian culture, cleansed of its own Jewish and Muslim roots, this bacon world, we've seen how the foodways of the Sephardim and conversos traveled across both the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and how in both spaces were used to shape and maintain identities that stand against those identities imagined and prescribed by the state or by the monarchy and by the church. So, thank you for listening to my talk. And as I said, if anyone's interested, I did bring a couple of, I have a very early recipe for eggplant that it's a fascinating, it's taken from a 13th century Arabic cookbook that's from Al-Andalus, but there's a whole section on Jewish dishes. So even though we don't have a Jewish cookbook from this early, you know, I find it really fascinating that an Andalusi Arab writer in Spain was like, hey, the Jews are cooking these things, and here's several recipes. And then also a recipe from David Gitlitz's cookbook that I mentioned, that which he took these Inquisition records and made recipes. So there's a bunch of photocopies up here. So if you're interested, you can get those. But anyway.
We have some time for questions.
Yeah.
Have you had an opportunity to meet or talk to any of the crypto Jews in the Southwest?
I have. Yeah, and I thought about putting that in. I've actually spoken at the Society for Crypto, what's it called? Crypto Judaism, I think, in New Mexico. And I used to teach in Southern California. Oh, She wanted to know if I'd had a chance to talk to any of the crypto Jews in New Mexico, or in the Southwest, right? Because it extends beyond. But I know in New Mexico there is, and actually it seems like some of the descendants of the Carvajales are in New Mexico. And I thought about putting it in because I know in talking to people, because when they have a conference every year in New Mexico, and I've been twice. Have you been?
We have them in California once.
Oh, and then we used to be in California, and I guess they also were in California, but in New Mexico and in El Paso, I also went, and they had it one year in El Paso, and you get not only scholars but people from the community, and a lot of times it's foodways, right? They'll be like, my grandmother, we always cook this one thing, but they thought they were Catholic, and then things started clicking, and they're like, wait, there's this long history that seems to go back to the Carvajales and some of the groups they led up into northern Mexico. So.
Have you had the opportunity to meet any of the ones who are actually practicing Jews and have remained underground? They're there. I mean,
yeah.
They're there in Arizona, New Mexico, and California, and they still, on the outside, look like Catholics.
Yeah.
But underneath, they are very definitely practicing Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And some are beginning to emerge, I hear.
Right.
But they're very hard to find. Have you had the opportunity to meet any of them?
Well, I mean, I've met them and talked briefly at these conferences to people who will just come up after talking and say, oh, I did, but I haven't sort of gone to their house and hung out with them, which would be a great, really fun experience. Have you?
I know some.
Do you?
Yeah.
It's fascinating, right?
And a group of several brothers and sisters, one has now broken the tradition and has joined the synagogue in Southern California, and it's causing a great ruckus in the family.
Because he's not crypto anymore, right?
Right, he's coming out about this.
He's coming out
of the closet in order to practice Judaism. He doesn't want his kids to grow up that way.
Oh, yeah, it's very interesting. When several years ago now, but when I was researching the Leonor de Carvajal, and I was working on her Inquisition thing and then published on it. It was the moment when Netanyahu's study on the Inquisition had come out, and there was a lot of debate about, are these people Jews or are they not Jews, right? They weren't part of a formal community, they didn't have a rabbi, and it's like, even no matter how much Luis and his family wanted to be, and consider themselves Jews, where do you draw that line in defining identity? Yeah. It's really interesting, yeah.
There are some classic modern Spanish dishes which are considered Jewish in origin, such as the cocido.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us why a dish like that, which features pork prominently,
Yeah.
would be considered Jewish in origin.
Yep, sorry. Well, oh yes, right, which in that Quevedo poem you can also translate as this type of dish, right? So it's a ubiquitous Spanish dish that comes to be called cocido. David Gitlitz talks a little bit about this, and the connection between adafina, these stews, right? Like everyone seems to have been eating stew. And then it was what you put into it. He says there's a distinction between what you find like in the north, in the cocidos, and what you find in the south, like more vegetables in the south and different sort of spice mixtures. Whether they're all Jewish, I don't know, right? If I would say all cocidos, if all stews are, but definitely adafinas were central in, they're the Sabbath stew and this sort of, the many examples I gave, mentioned from Inquisition records, we find documented, definitely. But Evelyn, this study opens with a really sort of, I think, brilliant reading of the opening of Don Quixote, which I'd never thought about, but it describes what he's eating, and it's one of these stews. And he calls it duelos y quebrantos, which is like pain and suffering, and it's like, oh, that's a really, and then you think about Americo Castro's argument about Cervantes, and it's like, oh, did all these people start eating, forced to eat these stews with pork, and rename it like this is this horrible thing I have to do now that I'm Christian, right? And they call it suffering and pain, right? Because why would you call your stew suffering and pain, right? So maybe, like, that's, I don't know if that speaks to your question, but no. Yeah. I have a lot of copies. There's plenty. I made like 40, so you're welcome to them. Yeah. The 2 recipes are from these 2 books. So the one on the right has lots of recipes, and they're great because I don't include it here, but he puts the whole first page and he says, okay, there was this trial in 1520 in Ciudad Real, right? And here's the, you know, she was tried by the Inquisition, blah, 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 and she mentions this. Then he gives a sort of modern adaptation because they've tried it out, and so they give you measurements. Like, you never find measurements. You might find, oh, there's a handful of this, then we threw in this, right? But they've sort of done the taste testing, right? So that narrows it down. The recipe I included from Food Matters is from that Arabic cookbook, a very early Arabic cookbook. So it doesn't have, it would be one that you could get and sort of try out in your own kitchen at home because it doesn't give all the specific measurements like we would have today. So, yeah.
Why was it really so important for the Spanish, the old Christians, to root out these crypto-Jews? I mean, lots of Christians accepted people bringing bunny rabbits and other things from other traditions into Christianity as long as they, you know, did some of this, they could bring some of their other stuff with them. Why was this so important?
Boy, that's like the $1 million question, right? I don't know that you know, it's a great question. You know, at this moment where, well, you have, like, I've been teaching in my class the sermons that were being like Vicente Ferrer was a very famous preacher from the late 1300s, early 1400s, and he became very influential. He's now considered San Vicente Ferrer, but if you read his, you know, what he was actively preaching, and he thought that he was the angel of the apocalypse. So all these things are coming, you know, a lot of different beliefs are coming together. So he thought his preaching was part of ushering in end times, and he had to cleanse, you know, like, and he was telling people they need to prepare for the end and cleanse all the impure, you know, get rid of all the things and, you know, make a pure society for this last judgment, basically. And there were pogroms associated with him preaching in towns, and he did like the big tour, you know, like he went on tour and went all over the peninsula. And you find sort of echoes of what he was saying in Colón's letters, the later letters, you know, so it seems like there were some very influential intellectual, they're not even intellectuals, because Vicente Ferrer was really going not for the elite. He was out really trying to get his message out, and he saw himself as part of this providential plan, and he was very anti-Semitic, like, you know, really, I mean, I don't think he said go after foodways, but I think it was this, you know, he was really urging people to be very anxious and think about this. I don't know if that answers your question.
It just scratches the surface. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have examples, maybe you said this, before the Inquisition, of food that brings people together? For example, in which someone from another faith background tastes a Jewish dish and praises it and copies it.
Yeah, actually, I mean, that was one of the reasons I wanted to include this on this handout. This it's written during the Almohad period, but in Al-Andalus, in Arabic or Muslim Spain, you have someone who puts together, I think it's an anonymous cookbook, it's attributed to someone, but who includes a whole section saying, and, you know, obviously ate with people and said, oh, these are great dishes, these are Jewish dishes, you know, so very familiar with what people are eating, and then saying, oh, we should, you know, include these in this cookbook. I'm trying to think. I know of another, I'm trying to think if I can recall the example. There's Juan de Segovia, who was a Christian cleric in the 1400s, he was at the Council of Basel. He was a rector at the University of Salamanca, and he ended up in a little monastery in France. But he brings a Quranic scholar because he wants to make a translation of the Quran. And they have dinner every night together, right? And they sort of talk about what Muslims eat and don't eat. It's not it's not an example of Jewish, but it's definitely an example. And the guy was there for months. And Juan de Segovia wrote letters to a lot of well-known Northern European scholars, like French scholars, and he will talk about these meals that he had with this Quranic scholar. So it's a case where they're not like just trying to figure out what they ate so they can damn them. Yeah. Yeah.
How much taboo was around eggplant? How did they grow or get eggplant at the time?
I think people liked eggplant. I think it's in the poetry where they start attacking each other for eating eggplant, or saying, I think it was the attacks are if someone is an excessive eater of eggplants, right? If they eat too much, because I think a lot of people ate eggplant. And I'm trying to remember, some of the poems are about how people's eyes, if they eat too much, start to look like eggplants, and I think they just had big bags under their eyes. So it's really that sort of not, like nonsensical poetry that's just insults about eggplants. But I think they definitely grew it, and I think Christians ate it as well, and for sure the Muslims on the peninsula ate lots of eggplant. And Cervantes, I mean, there's a couple of scholars who talk about that, because in Don Quixote, the author, the supposed Muslim author of the work, he does this really funny, sort of brilliant invention of a Muslim. He says, oh, the first chapters of the book were written by a Muslim, and he's like, and I can't remember his name, I think it was Mr. Eggplant. In Spanish it sounds very funny, like berenjeli, berenjena, but also playing with the idea, oh, Muslims eat a lot of eggplants too. So I don't know why the Spanish, these people picked up so much on eggplants and pork. Yeah.
What role, if any, do you think the proliferation of genetic testing and family history play in the revival or the renewed interest in Judeo-Spanish heritage?
I think it's already been really. The question was, what role does genetic testing have in the revival of Judeo-Spanish or Judeo-Spanish culture? I know from this group in New Mexico that it's already important, because one year I was there, they brought in someone who actually had his own firm for genetic. He was doing DNA kits. It was very early, now that I look back, it wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now, but he came and people were super interested. He was in Houston. And he gave a talk about how important it was. I don't know if the results were out, but I know that there was a lot of interest by people there. And I think, and actually in that community, because there was a debate among scholars before DNA testing. So Stanley Hordes is a historian who had argued that a lot of the people in New Mexico who claimed to be crypto-Jews, he said, he's just accepted it, but there was another woman scholar, I can't remember her name, and she said, well, I don't believe, it's just made up. They're sort of imagining it because they want to imagine that there's something besides, I'm really reducing her argument, but besides Mexican immigrants, right? So they're trying to recuperate a sort of aristocratic past, right? And then there was a study that came out after they've done genetic testing in this group that shows that actually many of them are descendants of this party that came with Carvajales and other conversos. They can tell a percentage of, or descendancy from, X percentage of Jewish DNA, right? And it's positive. So in that case, you have a clear example of this scholarship, we're not going to use that scholarship anymore. But it was a big debate in the early 2000s before people were getting the genetic testing. I don't know in elsewhere, but there is a concrete example.
Well, I'd like
like to invite everybody to continue the conversation. There's a reception in the back, and please join me again in thanking Professor Hamilton for a wonderful talk.
Thank